Okay, let us begin. Hello everyone. First, regarding our video recording, someone asked if someone checked actually if the recordings are available following the link that I provided you, and didn't find any recording. Actually, I contacted the IT service, and they discovered that they recorded a video for this class from another room. So it means that there are now no recordings. So far, they corrected it, and hopefully now the recordings will be available. But actually, I have my own recordings of our conversation. So if you want to revisit one of our meetings, you can send me a request, and I will email you a link. Okay. So hopefully it will work now. And today we will continue with the evolution of the church's self-awareness. We will particularly focus on the developments of this awareness in the period in the Age of Reason, what we call the Age of Reason. Or sometimes this age is also called the Enlightenment. What have you heard about Enlightenment? Any idea? Yeah.
It was a movement in the 15th and 16th century in Europe mostly, and it was basically against the Catholic Church because they basically claimed that religion is not the only source of truth, and that they supported the nature of human beings, and that they shouldn't just follow religion in order to be considered good.
Yes, this is correct, except the dates. The Enlightenment began a bit later, in the 17th century, and its golden age was really 18th century, with the French Revolution and the work of the so-called encyclopedies, French encyclopedies, people who try to codify all available knowledge of that time. Does someone want to add to this description of the Enlightenment? What features of the Enlightenment do you want to mention? Do you think we are still in the era of the Enlightenment, or we went further? What is your guess? Not quite sure. You are not enlightened. Yes.
I feel like it's sort of a second enlightenment that we're living nowadays, because the first one was sort of that intellectual knowledge of trying to get book smarts. But now we're in an age where technology is getting rapidly advancing, and we have to either get with it or be left behind, so to speak. So in that sense, it's not the same as the first enlightenment, but the same concepts are sort of repeating themselves.
Right. Yes, you are quite right. Indeed, we live in a sort of enlightenment. We're still in the enlightenment era, fortunately and hopefully, which is exactly as Andrew described. Is an era when people believe in their own forces. They believe in reason. That's why it is also called the Age of Reason. They don't need actually other sources of authority than reason, and religion in this regard is not necessarily. At the same time, this stage of the Enlightenment, or what you call the Second Enlightenment, which is quite innovative, But we live in the era when people still believe in the human reason, but they more and more realize the limitations of the human reason, especially they began doubting human reason and human feelings after the developments, discoveries in physics in the beginning of the 20th century with Einstein's theory of relativity, with say quantum mechanics. The purest age of reason was the 19th century. I said that the golden age was 18th century when people tried to codify all the knowledge. In the 19th century, they made the knowledge a religion. And this religion is called positivism. It's a positive, affirmative attitude to science. They believe that the science actually has replaced religion. And everything which is verifiable by scientific experiment is true. That's why people became a bit disappointed in the beginning of the 20th century when they realized, for instance, as a result of the quantum mechanics, that there is not always such a thing as objective reality. Because in the quantum mechanics, for instance, if people make an experiment in nuclear physics, the results of the experiment depends very much on the observer, on the subjectivity of the observer. So those experiments cannot be verified without an observer, without this subjective element. And other elements, other relativized, so to say, human age. But still we are pretty much in the era of reason. Sometimes we deny reason.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
everyone has signed, yes, please. Sometimes we deny reason, common sense, and we call it now post-truth, when people don't care about objective facts and truths, but they care about what they feel about reality, and the emotional attitude prevails over facts. That's what is post-truth about. But still we struggle with that. Also, the 20th century, and especially end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, reinstated the role of religion in the human society, what is now called post-secularism. The term post-secularism was coined in Germany, in Frankfurt, actually, I just came from Frankfurt, by Jürgen Habermas, a German intellectual, who was a protagonist of a neo-Marxist school, Frankfurt School of Critical Analysis of Critique. He's probably one of the greatest philosophers who lives now in Europe, on the European continent. And he introduced this idea of post-secularism as a new phase, a new stage of attitude to secularity, to secularization, to deprivation of the public space from religion. Okay? Religion comes back to the public space, and this is a part of our post-secular process, a huge social development which we witness now. One of the elements of this process is the rise of Islam, also in the Western countries, but also Christianity is pretty much on rise, even in the traditional secular settings. So that element of the age of reason that did not need religion or tried even to expel, to replace religion with rationality, with reason, has been relativized as well. Now at this second stage of the age of reason, we acknowledge more and more the role of religion, the positive role of religion in the society. And we don't see the same contradiction between science and society as people saw in the 19th century. In the 19th century, science and religion were absolutely irreconcilable. Either you believe in science or you believe in religion. Now this dilemma is not necessary. People don't need to choose. they can actually be both with science and religion. But still, we don't deny science. We still value science, and we still believe that science is important. Even though it is not irreconcilable with religion. So all those are features of the age of reason. And we are going to discuss today how this age has benefited the church. Because the age of reason not only expelled the church from, or tried to challenge the traditional positions of the church in the public square, but also benefited the church. And we are going to discuss this today. But before that, let us briefly reconsider what we have seen so far. So the church is in the center of our discussion. We were talking about the reason why the church exists, the descriptions, the language that the church describes itself. And we also studied some stages of the being of the church, particularly in the period of the late antiquity and in the period of the Middle Ages. What are the features of the late antiquity? What is late antiquity? You can explain. What is late antiquity?
That one, like hierarchies and all that started rising.
Yes, the hierarchy was on the rise, but generally, why we talk about late antiquity? Can you approximately say what was the period of late antiquity? Which centuries? Yes.
The 6 to 8 centuries.
Yes, that's correct. There is no strict kind of turning point between the late antiquity and Middle Ages, but approximately 6 to 8 centuries. And what are the features of late antiquity? Why it is different from the classical antiquity? And yes. Okay, what is antiquity? Let us consider. Let us see what is generally antiquity about. Does it have to do with antique shops? Then what it is about? Actually, it has to do with archaeological museums. You don't find items from late antiquity antique shops in antique shops, but you find them in the archaeological museums. Which period is that? And which cultures were protagonistic in the period of look at your notes. Okay, was America a part of the Pascha? No. Was China a part of the Pascha?
It was
Europe. Okay. In some sense, yes, but not the Europe. Which cultures in Europe? Yeah. Not exactly. It was on periphery. Jerusalem was on periphery. Yeah.
Italy.
What is that?
Italy.
Okay, Italy. Yes. Italy. Yes, Italy didn't exist at the time. Italy, for the first time,
Well,
was
the
established
Roman,
as a country in the 19th century. Before the 19th century, Italy didn't exist.
I mean the Roman Republic.
Yes, yes. Roman Empire, the Roman Empire, the classical Latin culture, and Greek culture. which was the protagonist for the Latin culture. In many senses, the Roman culture just copied the Greek culture. The Greek culture was really protagonistic. It was played the leading role. So effectively, what we call now ancient Greece and ancient Rome constituted two parts of the classical antiquity. Roman poets before Christ and Greek poets before Christ were poets, philosophers, intellectuals were the pillars of the classical antiquity. And it continued approximately until the 3rd century, when Christianity gradually took over it. And the Christian church continued, in a sense, the traditions of antiquity. And this period of time when the Christian church elaborated upon the classical antiquity is called Christian antiquity or late antiquity. So late antiquity is fundamentally Christian. It's a Christian version of antiquity, which continued, as you correctly mentioned, until the 6th, 8th century, depending on the region. Then the Middle Ages came. Until which century Middle Ages continued? Approximately. A bit earlier, because there was also a period of Renaissance, remember? Period of Renaissance. With the sculptures like Michelangelo, Dante.
Are you asking when the Renaissance started? Are you asking when the Renaissance?
No, I'm starting when the late antiquity, when the Middle Ages ended.
Wasn't it like, well, if you're talking about that, it went from Middle Ages to Renaissance, wouldn't it be around the 14th century?
Yes, it was approximately 14th, 15th century. The early Renaissance, the so-called Quattrocento and Quindecento, the 15th, 16th century, 15th primarily century was the peak of the Renaissance, and that was approximately an end of Middle Ages, at least in the Mediterranean countries like Italy. Well, what we now call Italy at the time, they were different Italian policies which were independent, as they were independent states, like Florence, like Venice, like Genoa, and others. And then the modernity started, and we already mentioned that the modern ages began in the 16th century. 17th century was the beginning of the period of reason, age of reason, and actually the age of reason coincided and cohered in many regards with the modern era. So modern era is marked by the dominance of reason, and we call it also the age of reason. Okay. We were discussing with you the Reformation last time, right? As a process of emancipation. And essentially the Reformation produced an impetus, a momentum for the modernization of the society. It became an engine of the developments that led eventually to modernity and to the age of reason. The liberation of human individual, when a human individual was allowed to study the Holy Scripture, the Bible, on his or her own, without assistance from a priest or a bishop, liberated to a great extent the human mind, and the human mind went even further. And eventually, some people decided to liberate themselves from religion per se. So the Reformation became an engine for modernization of the modern societies. And when the United States emerged, they absorbed most features of the Age of Reason. The protagonists, people of the founders of the United States, people like particularly like George Washington, they were people of modernity, of early modernity, people of the age of reason already, and they took some elements from the French developments, from English developments, English philosophy, French political science, and they implemented those features by establishing the United States and struggling for the independence of this country. So the United States is greatly a product of the age of reason and of the Enlightenment. The United States never had the previous periods in its history, like the Middle Ages or late antiquity or classical antiquity. It emerged just in the age of reason. Okay. So again, we are going to talk about today more about the age of reason, but let us make a short excursus to all these periods that I've just mentioned, late antiquity, Middle Ages, and beginning of modernity, from the perspective of the evolution of self-awareness. The Church evolved during all these periods and considered itself differently at each stage of this evolution. When we are talking about the self-awareness of the Church, about how the Church considered itself, we imply a sort of subject in the Church, that the Church is a subject, right? The Church receives. Sometimes the Church is described with pronouns applied mostly to rational beings, like he or she. Well, the Church is often addressed as she, because the female imagery was extremely popular regarding the Church, which implies also some kind of subjectivity in the Church. But the question is if the Church is a subject, if the Church is actually a sort of person that can be addressed or can address someone else. What would be your guess? Say, the Catholic Church, does she have a subject in your judgment? What I mean is, can you actually, we believe in the Church, just according to the creed, just like we believe in God. Does it mean that the Church has the same subjectivity as God? What would be your guess?
I don't necessarily think it has the same subjectivity as God. It's more of I guess an abstract concept because the Church is made up of its body, like all the people. So if you were to address every single member of the Church at once, I guess you could say you could address the Church. But as a concept, it's a little too abstract to just pin down.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Yes, the Church is a number of subjects. Real subjects of the Church are people, those who belong to the Church. And they, in sum, constitute a kind of collective subject, but subject is, in a sense, as it were, a subject, not a subject proper. And it's just a collectivity of the members of the Church. In this regard, the question is, can we talk about the awareness, self-awareness of the Church in the same sense as we talk about self-awareness of us? We, as human beings, we have our own self-awareness. We change. We perceive ourselves differently at each age that we pass. Right? Our perception of ourselves depends very much on the circumstances, historical circumstances where we live, on our families, on our societies, on where we are, or on our jobs, and so forth. So this self-awareness of us varies, it changes. We know that. At the same time, we know that we are the same. We cannot be one time one person and another time another person. We are the same person. There is something which doesn't change in our self-awareness. In the same sense, we can speak about the Church. The Church's self-awareness also changes all the time, depending on the circumstances, on the age, on the era where the Church exists. At the same time, there is something which is unchangeable in this self-awareness. And what we are talking about is how different stages, these stages, late antiquity, Middle Ages, modernity, affected the self-awareness of the church. What changed in the church, and what didn't change in the church. Okay? Regarding how the church perceives itself, which means how the members of the church perceive their togetherness, their membership in the church. Speaking about the subjectivity of the church, we are talking about the way how the majority of the members of the church perceive their belonging to the church. And the same applies to any group, not just to the church. We can talk about, say, a collective subjectness of the citizens of the US. That's how you perceive your belonging to your country, to your culture. And this perception is more or less common. Of course, there are always those who disagree with the mainstream perception, but there is a more or less common perception, and it varies. It changes all the time, depending on the circumstances, depending on who is the president or what is the environment around the country. Like the dramatic change in the self-perception of the American society was the World War II, which affected the entire world, and we changed also the self-understanding of the Americans, and so forth. Or the war in Vietnam, the same. So all those things change. At the same time, there is something which is unchangeable in the society, as there is something which is unchangeable in the church. Okay? Yes?
Isn't what's supposed to be like unchangeable in the church is like the doctrine of the church?
Yes, it is the
You
doctrine.
can have like
Exactly.
priests like Father Martin who's like advocating for like homosexuality in the church, or even Pope Francis with the Mors Laetitia, like how it's bringing confusion about certain doctrine of the church and practices of the church. So what's supposed to, I guess, remain unchanged is that, like, no matter who the Pope is or what a specific priest says, like, what the church is supposed to, the authority is supposed to implement, it's like its doctrine, no matter who might be in charge of.
Well, it depends how we define the doctrine. There is the belief of the church, and there is the language in which the belief is expressed. The language changes, the belief doesn't. On the one hand. On the other hand, there are things, even beliefs, that change, and sometimes they don't change. Like we cannot change the belief in the Trinity, in God, right? Or in that Jesus Christ is God. But certainly some moral norms, they change, because they were conditioned in the first place by different historical circumstances. Still, when we are talking about the perception of those norms, we are talking about the collective perception of those norms by the members of the church. So it's greatly a function of the collective self-awareness of the church, which is a sum of self-awarenesses of each member of the church. Okay? Does it make sense to you? It's a bit complicated, but I hope it makes sense. Yeah.
So would it be like canon law is what remains unchanged?
Well, canon law is something which is changeable,
Okay.
because canon law is a law, and the canon law is not, facts from God to the church. It was elaborated upon by generations of lawyers in the church. It reflected greatly the legal systems in the countries where it was articulated. In the Middle Ages, well, the Catholic canon law was codified and articulated primarily in the countries like France in the Middle Ages. And it is based on the Roman law, which was re-articulated by Justinian in the 6th century in the East, Christian East. That kind of Christian Roman law was based on the previous pre-Christian Roman law, which was totally like a device of human beings, of those politicians who articulated those laws. So the canon law is very much human. It's a human device, more than the doctrine. Okay. So coming back, that's about self-awareness of the church. And we discussed already with you how the church began considering itself as a distinct subject. Again, it was still a collective subject, but it was a subject which was distinct from the Jewish community, the early Jewish community on the one hand, and from the Roman world on the other hand. The earliest development in the self-awareness of the church that we discussed was from the church as a community of disciples to the church as a community of fellows, a community of those who believe in Christ, from the community of those who saw and actually conversed with the alive Christ, to the community of those who never saw Christ, but they believe in Christ. That was the first development of the church's self-awareness, and it was a feature of the late antiquity. So the late antiquity, the self-awareness of the church in the late antiquity featured a good deal of plurality in understanding by people of what is the church, and by a good deal of communitarianism, them belonging to a community, and their understanding of being members of the church as members of a community. So the late antiquity, we can call it now, was very much about networking, about building networks, horizontal dimension in the church, okay? Enhancing this horizontal dimension in the church. At the same time, as you already correctly reminded us, hierarchies became rising in the period of late antiquity and shaped the church in the period of the Middle Ages. Right, so the Middle Ages, yeah, so the Middle Ages was the Middle Ages was marked exactly by hierarchies. In the late antiquity and in the period of Middle Ages, not just hierarchies was on the rise. This era was marked by the close relationship between the church and the state. This relationship was established in the 4th century by the Roman Emperor Constantine to allow Christianity to be legal first, and then made Christianity the main religion of the Roman Empire. The successors of Constantine, people like Theodosius, the Emperor Theodosius in the end of the 4th century, made Christianity the only permissible religion in the Roman Empire. And effectively, Theodosius and others, like people like Justinian, emperors like Justinian, transformed the Roman Empire into completely Christian state. The church and the state coincided with each other. The church and the Roman Empire coincided with each other to the extent that it even affected the self-awareness of the church. The church began considering itself, the members of the church, right, the collective subject of the church, began considering itself as a part of the Roman world, or as the Roman world per se. Well, the same people, the same citizens of the Roman Empire were Christians and were citizens. There was no dichotomy, there was no schizophrenia in their mind. So the same people considered themselves members of the church and citizens of the Roman Empire. That's how the two self-consciousness, the Roman consciousness, which was pertinent to the Roman Empire, and the Christian consciousness, which was pertinent to the Christian church, merged together and constituted one single self-awareness. To the extent that people could not imagine themselves being Christians without being Roman citizens, or being Roman citizens without being Christians. So this period of symphonies, the so-called symphonies, that is the period of close relationship between the church and the state, was marked by a transformation of the ecclesial self-awareness of the church as a blend of political self-awareness of Romans as Roman citizens and Christians as members of the church. Does it make sense to you? We probably can hardly imagine that because we live in a completely new situation. The situation when the church and the state are separated from each other. But this is a new thing. Traditionally, for centuries, people lived with a completely different preset of understanding of themselves. This preset required from them to understand themselves both politically and ecclesially as belonging to the Roman Empire and to the church simultaneously. Okay? It's a bit difficult. It's about, trying to walk in someone else's shoes. Besides that you never wear. We cannot understand those people in the same way as they would not understand us, because they never had an experience of separation of the church from the state. They never had this experience of just belonging just to the church without feeling of that I belong to the state necessarily by belonging to the church. Okay? So you have just to think out of the box this plan and to imagine how people would feel at that time by belonging both to the empire and to the church and without distinguishing between them. Okay? That's how the period of symphonies worked. And that was the longest period in the history of the church. For the most time, Christians felt like this. That was the longest experience for the Christians ever. They understood themselves as members of a state longer than any other period when they did not understand themselves as members of the state before the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, before the 4th century, or after the 16th, 17th century, when the process of separation between the church and the state started. Okay, so all this period, from the 4th century approximately to the 17th century approximately, all this period, how many? 13th centuries, okay? The self-awareness of the church was blended into the self-awareness of the state. They constituted one single self-awareness. Okay? Does it make sense? Any questions? It's not easy to understand, I know. We have to. Why we call this period symphonies? Symphony is a technical word which was used by Justinian, Emperor Justinian, actually in the corpus of the Roman law as he compiled this corpus. All modern laws in different countries, they are rooted in the system of law which was compiled by Justinian in the 6th century, the so-called Codex Juris Civilis. Justinian himself put together different laws of the Roman Empire. In the pre-Christian Roman Empire, there was no constitution. There were no codexes of law. There were laws, but they were like separate laws. It was similar to the British law, modern British law, which is based on precedents. Britain has no constitution. Britain has laws, certainly, but they don't describe every single aspect of human life. mostly precedents describe many aspects. The American system is kind of mixed. It is based on precedents, but it has also constitution and the code of law. So the Justinian actually created this new reality of codification of the Roman law, and actually the idea of symphony between the church and the state appears for the first time in that compilation of Justinian. From the very beginning of the modern legal systems, the idea of symphony was already embedded to those systems. Symphony as harmony, as cooperation, as togetherness of the church and of the state. Okay? Hope it makes sense for you. We go further. Then the era of the Enlightenment comes. And this era, the part of which was greatly instigated by the Reformation, as I mentioned, and this era also had some consequences for the church. It made, for some intellectuals, it made religion obsolete, not necessarily to explain the world around us. For some intellectuals, only the reason was sufficient to explain the world around us. The reason was enough. Religion was not anymore needed to explain the world. Also, another consequence was that the church became separated from the state. The states began building walls between the state and the church. This phrase, the wall, was for the first time used by Jefferson in the early 19th century when he wrote a letter to a Baptist community in Connecticut describing a wall between the church and the state as protecting those minorities. Baptists were a minority in Connecticut. Connecticut was dominated by the Congregationalists, by Puritans, called Puritans. And Puritans were pretty much intolerant to everyone else who were not Puritans. And that was the majority religious group in New England, in the states like Massachusetts, Connecticut. To a less extent, Rhode Island. Rhode Island actually descended from that group, although it was established also by Puritans. And they went up to New Jersey and New York, the states of New Jersey and New York. So they were pretty much intolerant, and those minorities who lived on the territory of those states suffered the loss. So Jefferson actually extended his protection to those minorities by offering to build a wall between the church and the state. The state should not intervene into the matters of the church. The churches should manage themselves, and that's why it was not up to the political authorities of the state to manage religious affairs in the state. Okay? So essentially, this war was not against religion per se. It was to protect minorities, religious minorities. Okay? Of course, in the 20th century, already in the 19th century, some politicians and some groups in the United States began interpreting this wall suggested by Jefferson as separating religion as such from the state, as expulsion of religion from the state, from the public square. That was one of the interpretations of the separation of the wall. But it's just one of the interpretations. Another interpretation comes back to the original Jeffersonian idea of protecting minorities without favoring majorities by the state. So the state should be neutral to religion, but not against religion. Okay? Does it make sense to you?
In the last box that says modern challenges for the suffering.
Yeah, I will explain. We'll come to that.
Oh.
We'll come. We just go gradually one by one. We are just here. So, and as I'm explaining from the autonomy of the reason, the original impetus of the age of reason, we came to the autonomy of the state from the church, and to the process of secularization as expulsion of the church from the public square. the process which began in the 18th century, became particularly strong in the 19th century, and now somehow fading out with the process of post-secularization in our days. All those are features of the Age of Enlightenment. Because Enlightenment changed the status quo for the churches. It challenged the symphony, the close relationship between the church and the state. Because the Enlightenment challenged the authority of the church and tried to replace this authority of the church by the authority of human reason, sometimes non-believing reason, the reason that doesn't believe in God. The churches normally don't like Enlightenment. They consider the Enlightenment as something evil, as something very bad. Well, the Catholic Church continued fighting against the Enlightenment from the 19th century up to the Vatican II. Actually, only during the Vatican II, Council Vatican II, in the 1960s, the Church eventually reconciled. The Catholic Church eventually reconciled with the Enlightenment. Before that, there was a very fierce war between the Church, the Catholic Church, and the Enlightenment. Those wars were called cultural wars. So the culture wars of the Catholic Church were the wars against the Enlightenment. Modern evangelicals in the United States, like conservative Christians in different denominations, they don't like Enlightenment either. If they have heard about the Enlightenment, which is not always the case, of course. So if they are aware about the roots of the secularization in the modern society, in the Enlightenment, they really come to hate the Enlightenment. However, the Enlightenment brought a lot of good things to the Church. Primarily, the Enlightenment allowed the Church to be Church, allowed to emancipate, remember the word, right? To emancipate from the state, to detach itself from this common self-awareness of the Church and of the state. The common self-awareness that developed during the Middle Ages, in the era of symphonies. So all those 13 centuries, or even more, that the Church and the state constituted one single self-awareness. They had featured one single self-awareness. All that period was challenged by the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment tried to change the status quo, and actually this led to the Church emancipating from this common theopolitical self-consciousness, self-awareness. The Church began realizing itself as the Church, something that it had in this period, in the apostolic era, in the early period of its existence, when the Church also realized itself as the Church, not a part of the state machinery, not a part of the empire. Okay? Does it make sense to you guys? Any question? So that's why we are talking about the rise of the Church self-awareness as a positive influence of the Enlightenment on the Church, something that should be appreciated, even if people hate the Enlightenment because they think that the Enlightenment challenged the authority of Christianity. And this rise of the self-awareness led to a real kind of burst of the reflections of the Church upon itself. The Church began, when the Church discovered that it can exist without the state, that the Church is the Church, it led to actually many studies of the phenomenon of the church. And those studies are called ecclesiology. We already studied a bit this word. Ecclesiology comes from the word ecclesia, the church, and logos, the study about the church. Ecclesiology is a science, is a discipline, theological discipline that studies the church. And this discipline, we can say, emerged or became really, really kind of important in theology with the rise of self-awareness of the church. So this rise of self-awareness led to the theology, to the ecclesiological studies, to the studies about the church. And those studies were quite interesting. They occurred in different countries. Let us see first the case of English ecclesiology, or Victorian ecclesiology, in the Victorian period of the British history. Why we call it Victorian? Why we call kind of Victorian culture, Victorian period? What is that? Yeah. Yeah, back in Victoria. Yeah, exactly. When did she rule? Do you remember approximately? Which was the Victorian period? Any guess without looking to Google? Any idea? Okay. Most of the 19th century. So she died at the turn of the century, of the 20th century. So most of the 19th century was Victorian, which was actually the golden age of the British Empire, and also the rise of the British culture. And ecclesiology became a part of that rise. We can talk about it. The Victorian ecclesiology, and actually the very word ecclesiology was for the first time used by English in the framework of the so-called Oxford and Cambridge movements. Those were interesting movements of revival of theology. Oxford movement has produced such figures as Cardinal Newman, for instance. Have you heard about Cardinal Newman? No? One of the key figures in the. If you do you know James Joyce? Irish writer, right? His most famous novel is Ulysses. Okay, he has written another novel, which is called A Self-Portrait of a Young Artist, where he described his young years in Ireland, where they studied that Cardinal Newman was the most prolific writer of all ages. He was not certainly, but people studied in the Catholic schools that Newman is the kind of figure number one in everything. He was originally an Anglican, a member of the Oxford movement, and then converted to the Roman Catholic Church, and became a cardinal. So it was a kind of movement of revival in Oxford. They discussed more ideas. They discussed more theology, philosophy. In Cambridge, they paid more attention to architecture and to art. There was a kind of renaissance of culture in Cambridge, and the renaissance, the turn of the interest to the church architecture, they called it ecclesiology. Originally, ecclesiology meant an interest to the church architecture. Many old English churches were redundant at the time or destroyed after the Middle Ages, and they collected money, organized effort to restore those churches, and this was also called ecclesiology. So ecclesiology was initially about the buildings of the churches. but later on it became also an interest to the church per se as the phenomenon. Okay. That was kind of input of the Victorian era to the rise of the Church of Self-Awareness. On the continent, at the same time, especially in Germany, there were other developments. The idealistic philosophy and romanticism were on rise. Among the most important philosophers, idealist philosophers at the time were Kant and Hegel. There was also Schleiermacher, who tried to marry philosophy with theology, or remarry philosophy and theology. And he exercised a tremendous impact upon the development of the church. There was also romanticism, a romantic kind of tendency in literature. Last time, I think, one of the previous times, some one of you has mentioned Goethe, okay? A poet a German poet who was prolific. And I asked you, do you know about Goethe? No one answered me. So that for this reason, when I was in Frankfurt last weekend, I just, especially for that reason, went to the house of Goethe, because he was born in Frankfurt, and made some pictures for you. I'll show you now these pictures. And I did this because Goethe was the father of Romanticism, of this tendency, of this direction in the culture, in the European culture, which featured romantic attitudes, which we will explain right now. So let me go to my Google account. So, just make sure. Yeah, here it is. So this is the house, the so-called Goethe house, the house where Goethe was born in Frankfurt. And just to show you, the atmosphere of the time. That's how it is inside. It's a sort of museum of Romanticism, if you want. Nice place. Well, this guy, his name is Herder. He is a person who contributed to the development of the modern theory of nation. He connected the idea of nation with culture. He, for the first time, explained a nation as a particular culture. His name was Herder. This is actually Goethe when he was in Italy. This is Herder again. This is another portrait of Goethe. And this is a sort of neoclassical sculptures that express the idea of Romanticism. Romanticism was about romanticizing the past, especially the classical antiquity past, the ancient Greek and Roman culture. It was about not just restoring that culture, but also enjoying the remnants, the ruins of that culture. Romanticism had a grain of sorrow, of sadness about the golden age which has passed, which remained in the past. In the Romantic pictures, you will see a lot of depictions of ruins of Rome and Greece. In the poetry, you will find also a lot of disappointment and discontent. You will find elements of nostalgia about the past. In ecclesiology, it was approximately the same. In ecclesiology, it was a good deal of nostalgia about the past of Christianity, about the antiquity, the period of antiquity in Christianity. And it was also a lot about idealizing the past without sober and objective inquiry into the past. It was about romanticization, about idealization of the past. That's what exactly the Romantic ecclesiology was about depicting an ideal picture of the church. And the same idea was supported by the idealistic philosophy, by the ideas of Hegel, Schleiermacher, and others. So all the German culture of the beginning of the 19th century, which featured idealism in philosophy and romanticism in art, it contributed to a new picture of the church, to a new self-awareness of the church. It cohered with this discovery of the church by itself. When the church realized, when the members of the church, people of the church realized that there is such a thing as the church which is different from the state. And it fascinated them a lot. And they produced a kind of ideal picture of the church, riding on similar ideas in the German philosophy and art of the time, including on people like Goethe. Okay? Does it make sense to you? In the Catholic Church, these idealistic ideas amalgamated in the so-called Tübingen School, a school established in a Catholic enclave around Tübingen in Germany. And there were some Catholic theologians, like Johannes Adam Möller, who lived in the beginning of the 19th century, and he produced an amazing theology, an amazing ecclesiology. He actually disconnected himself from the medieval theology about the church and produced a new understanding of theology which we know now, which greatly influenced the Vatican II, for instance, the Council of Vatican II. So those ideas produced by the Tübingen School, by the influence of the Romantic theology on Romanticism, on theology, on the Catholic theology, produced new ideas about the church. The church was perceived now not just as a hierarchical structure, not as a pyramid under the Pope, under the leadership of the Pope, but as a community, as togetherness, as membership. So this was a contribution of this romantic ecclesiology to a new self-awareness of the church, to a new iteration of the evolution of the church's self-consciousness. Okay? Does it make sense? So, romantic theology, this romantic understanding, romanticization, idealization of the church produced a new understanding of the church which we have now. The understanding of the church which emphasizes unity, community, togetherness. not just hierarchy and discipline, not just this vertical dimension, but also a very strong horizontal dimension, which brings us back again to the apostolic era. That's why they had nostalgia about the past of Christianity and try to bring some elements of that past to their present. Okay. In Russia, the same ideas were expressed by a Russian theologian, also lay theologian. Müller was not a priest even, he was a lay person. And in Russia there was another lay person whose name was Yakov, and he articulated similar ideas and expressed them through the word sobornost, which means conciliarity, kind of togetherness. So we find how the same kind of tide of emancipation, remember, regarding the church covers different traditions, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and so forth. And that was a feature of the 19th century. Okay. In the Orthodox setting, this changed the way how the church began governing. So self-awareness, the perception of itself by the church, changed the way how the church became ministry, how it became administered, governed. So the governance of the church relies very much on the idea about the church. The idea about the church influences the way how we manage the church. This applies not only to the church, it applies to any system. If you take a business, if you take a community, you will find out that the ideas about this particular community changes the way how this community is managed. So this is also about the church. The management of the church changed under the influence of these new ideas, romantic ideas, and it introduced new forms of conciliarity in the Christian East particularly, which comprised now not just bishops, patriarchs, but also lay people. So the change of the paradigm, emancipation of the church, led to widening the representation in the church governance by lay people. That was a direct impact of the changes of self-awareness upon the way how the church was governed. Okay, does it make sense? That's how some interesting councils occurred in the Balkans, the councils which included bishops, priests, and lay people. And the most important council of this sort was the council in Moscow in 1917-1918, which was similar to the Vatican II in a sense, in its emancipatory power, in its impetus to change, to make the church more focused on the faithful, on the people. In the Catholic Church, at the same time, the tendencies were a bit different. In the Catholic Church faced in Europe, on the continent, it faced a challenge of social changes. It was a period in the middle of the 19th century. It was a period of the social revolutions in Europe, when some monarchies fell and were either substituted or put together with representative democracies. So people began electing their parliaments. The people received more power, and this power challenged monarchical structures, including the Catholic Church. Because the Catholic Church was a strictly hierarchical structure at the time. Also, the rise of nationalism, of national movements, challenged the Catholic Church. national states tried to establish their own independent churches independent from Rome, and that was received as a challenge for the Catholic Church as well. So instead of adjusting itself to the new realities of Europe, the Catholic Church chose to contest those realities, to reverse the tide of changes. That's how the Council, the First Vatican Council, happened. The Council Vatican I was quite conservative, very conservative. Exactly at this council, for the first time officially, the Catholic Church adopted the idea of infallibility of popes. It was only in 1870 when the Vatican I happened. Before that, the Catholic Church didn't officially proclaim this teaching. And it was a reaction to the church, to the changes in the society at that time. So we see how the self-awareness of the church went in two ways. On the one hand, in one case, the self-awareness contributed to the emancipation of the church, to including, to making the church to include lay people, wider representation. Okay, like in the case of the Eastern churches. On the other hand, we see, and the churches began understanding themselves more and more as people of God, not just the Pope and hierarchy. On the other hand, for a while, the Catholic Church developed a new kind of understanding of itself as a very strict hierarchical structure. And this understanding continued until Vatican II. Only the Council of Vatican II, remember we discussed it last time, right? When we discussed emancipation, emancipated the church from itself, from those hierarchical structures, and included more lay people, and suggested what they called aggiornamento. It's an Italian word meaning adjustment to the modern society. Okay? So, Vatican I is quite a problematic council even for the Catholic Church. And the Catholic theologians struggle to explain it, at least in the light of Vatican II, because they were quite different. They were rather irreconcilable with each other. I want to show you a brief video clip about Vatican I, where a theologian explains a bit about it.
Did you know that the wrong mattress protector can ruin the feel of your mattress?
To do this again on his own, that he has to. You can buy.
I don't know.
If you don't get physically
In this lecture, we're looking at Catholicism in Vatican I. And what we're looking at here is the evolution of some of the changes in terms of engagement with Europe that the papacy went through in the 19th century. And the context here is that so very often the tale of modernism versus the church, the ways in which the church fought against the more radical Enlightenment, as well as the rise of nationalism within Europe, which sought to absolutize the political order over everything. Too often that tale is told as merely one of Protestants, or in particular evangelicals, versus science or reason or something like this. Now certainly, as we've seen, and as we're going to see as we go forward, evangelicalism and Protestant orthodoxy went through a series of conundrums. They went through a series of splits. And we're going to look at that when we get to the lecture on fundamentalism in particular. However, what we have to see is that It is not simply evangelicalism or Protestantism that deals with these problems. In this lecture and in our next lecture on the Oxford movement, we're going to see another reaction or another set of reactions against the changes that are going on in the 19th century and the realities that are happening on the ground in Europe as well as in America involve a couple of different things, both politically and philosophically. We've already covered most of the broad contours of the Enlightenment and its radicalization. We've talked about the scientific revolution as well as the philosophical Enlightenment that often drove a wedge between matters of faith and matters of reason. At times, the relationship was growing quite frosty, though it's really not until the late 19th century and early 20th century that the relationship is fundamentally broken between science and faith, or between the Enlightenment and faith. We saw this in Voltaire, for example. Voltaire, for all of his personal animus against faith in general or against the Christian faith overall, still never really was the voice of a rabid secularism that sought to overthrow religion and do away with it entirely. His focus was often more on toleration and just allowing people to have all of their different views and put them over into the category of, we might use the word today, relativism. So a Protestant group of all different kinds, a Catholic group, etc., can all live according to their convictions, and they should stop fighting. They should not wed themselves with the political orders, and they should not impose their views from the top down. One of the great holdovers from the Reformation period in the 17th century, so roughly, you might say 150 years, is that in certain countries and in certain contexts, despite the Revolutionary era and despite some of the changes that had happened as a result of the Enlightenment and other factors, the church and state problem had not quite resolved itself as fully as people, maybe in the modern world, like to think that it had. We saw this, for example, in France, where the crown very often saw itself as either over the church or at times, depending on the monarch, depending on his personal views, as the enforcer of Catholic orthodoxy. The Catholic Church in Protestant nations, or at least historically Protestant nations, even if they were growing increasingly secular, also was coming under fire. And we talked about Catholic oppression or suppression in the American context, but the same would be true in other countries as well. In Germany, the political order by this point was relatively secular, you might say. It was not overtly based off of a religious principle of being Lutheran or something like this. But what's going on here in the early to mid 1800s is that in countries where there is an expressed religious commitment, the complexities of the Catholic Church's involvement with that country was only increasing. And in countries where there was a secular order, maybe after a revolution, or in America after the separation of church and state dogmas were put in place during the revolution, the Catholic Church in these areas often, as we've seen, had to do a bit of a dance between expressing itself as loyal and faithful to the ideals of the culture around them at large, as well as maintaining their unique identity as Roman Catholic. Well, at the more popular level, or at least at the maybe philosophical level, most countries experience some amount of criticism against the Catholic Church for having political power that was interfering with the maybe desires or the policies of those who were in power. This is particularly the case in France. France had always, from the time of the Huguenots, and of course long before, been partner to the papacy and to the Roman Catholic Church. And by and large, the same was true in Italy and other countries. However, the complexities were, again, that many of these countries began to change, adapt, or to chart new paths as to the principles of their nation. And so, increasingly in some areas, there was not as much commitment to follow the will of the Pope. They were not as entangled, maybe, at least interpersonally, as they had once been. And if you add to that the rise of rationalism, materialism, and a real heady scientific antithesis to the faith, the Catholic Church was in a position, and the Pope in particular was in a position, to feel that the situation was not all the best footing, and that people were beginning to slip. Not so much that they were beginning to slip away from the Catholic Church by and large, but there began to arise some ideas about the role of the Pope and his particular authority in the life of the Church or in the life of society. Some began to question whether or not the Pope had the right to challenge or to define dogma on his own. There arose a number of different theories about the distribution of authority throughout the Catholic Church, and if the Catholic Church in France is loyal to the crown, well then at times that put them in jeopardy of challenging what the Pope had to say. And you can see, again, this has a lot of different applications in a lot of different countries all throughout Europe and in North America. How are those living in a variety of different contexts going to understand their role in relationship to the authority of the church, and in particular to the authority of the papacy? And there are a number of different things that really set off a desire to have a council to redefine, or to double down, you might say, on the understanding of the Pope's authority. In 1854, the papacy defined what we today know as the Immaculate Conception. Now, this is often misunderstood by non-Catholics or by those who are not Christian at all. The Immaculate Conception is not related to Jesus' birth per se, at least primarily. Sometimes you do see a confusion here, this idea that the Immaculate Conception or the sinless conception, immaculate just means without sin, that this somehow refers to Christ being sinless. Well, that's not the case. The Immaculate Conception promulgation in 1854 was about the sinlessness of Mary, that Mary was born without sin in preparation of her being the Mother of God, and this had been a more or less traditional doctrine that runs back through various threads to the Middle Ages.
It's now a detail which
it
is
certainly
not
wasn't ever
very
defined.
much important to our discussion, but what is important to our discussion is that the development of the Catholic Church, which epicentered in Vatican I, reflected self-awareness of the Church vis-à-vis new developments in Europe, particularly modernism and secularism and nationalism in Europe. Okay? It changed the way how the Catholic Church perceived itself, so that the Catholic Church had to articulate this norm about papacy, the infallibility of popes. And it also delayed for a long time the readjustment of the Catholic Church to the developments in the modern society. The relationship of the Church with the modern society is a tricky thing. That's how we come here to this block, which is modern challenges for the self-awareness of the Church, how not to get lost in the society. This is the word, sorry, it's not included here in the box, in the society. The Church in the Middle Ages had a symphony with the state. The Church was conflated with the state. The self-awareness of the Church merged with the self-awareness of the state. In the modern era, the same challenge the Church faced from the society. The Church developed close relationship with the society, which is very good. The Church has to have relationship, a symphony with the society. It's much better than to have a symphony with the state. But it has its own pitfalls, because the Church, in the same way as in the Middle Ages, it had blended itself into the state. The Church can blend up with the society to the extent of lacking distinction between the Church and the society. So that even the imagined demarcation line between the Church and the society would be lost. That is a kind of challenge which has been criticized by some conservatives in the Catholic Church and in the Protestant churches, and which still needs a resolution. That is a sort of blending up of Church's self-awareness with the self-awareness of the society, which makes the Church completely dissolved in the society. Something that some, maybe Protestant churches, mostly the West, face. So that they embark on social agendas and forget their mission as the Church sometimes.